everybody. Welcome back for another Shoulda Boosted episode 24. And today I am joined by Tom. Tom, how's it going?
Not too bad, man. How about you?
It's going okay. You know, it's sunny. I actually got to go out there and do lots of walking. It's to the point now where I'm starting to get like a suntan. So that it's a good thing.
Yeah, I'm excited now that the snow's melted. I can actually ride my bike on a regular basis to get some exercise because I live in a 2-bedroom apartment. There's nothing going on here.
Oh, yeah, that'd be the worst if you're just kind of like stuck in two different rooms and trying to just pretend like this will be my whatever corner or something. But
well, I've got the hobby room, I've got the bedroom, and I've got the living room. So
okay, so there's a little bit there, but yeah, for sure, getting outside is even better.
Oh, totally.
So the reason why we got Tom on here today is because we have a new Steamroller package coming out. All we know so far from William Hungerford is that there will be interesting changes in the way that's going to be working, but I want to go even further into that because Tom has been playing a whole bunch of different games for a long time and has definitely had opinions on the way that scenarios might be changed to actually be a lot more interactive and interesting. And I thought now is a good time for all of us to be thinking about things like that. And so I guess before we get too far into that, Tom, do you want to just give us a quick little like who you are and what games you've played and what type of stuff you like?
Yeah, I guess everyone that knows me knows I've always been more of a casual player than a competitive one. But honestly, it's probably an easier list to say the games I haven't played, and that's Guild Ball and Infinity. And those are the only ones I can think of that I haven't played.
Wow.
Yeah. Like, there might be some more obscure games out there that, like, someone's going to be like, oh, what about this one that I might have not played? But, like, really, if it's Games Workshop game, I've played it. If it's a Privateer Press game, I've played it. I've played Malifaux. I've even played some of those old, like, now dead Spartan games, the Drop Zone stuff, the some historical miniature games, and like the list just keeps going on. So, but yeah, big hobbyist. I love painting models. For me, it's just one of those things that just relieves stress, and kind of I like the immersive aspect of miniature gaming, which is why I've often been a fairly vocal person about scenarios and mixing it up and having them be something that makes to a more dynamic game or an interesting game or even a game that kind of makes sense in a lot of ways, like that what armies would be doing. So
yeah, absolutely.
A big criticism of Steamroller for the longest time was the joke about, well, who really cares about circles and rectangles? But
And I think that's the biggest reason why I think you're perfect to talk about things like this, because, I mean, if you have a 40K person and a Warmachine person trying to talk about scenarios, most of them just know their own system, and it turns into just a me versus you. But when you have somebody that's played all these different games and knows the different potential options out there, a lot more can really come from that. So I think you're going to be perfect and great for this. But maybe just to kind of kick things off, you already kind of hinted at that, but right now, with the way that Steamroller is going, what are the cons? What's sort of the real thing that's missing from the scenarios right now as we have them?
Like, honestly, I think for me, the biggest thing that's missing is they've all got these different names, and presumably they come from something, but there's always been a bit of a disconnect between what they call the scenarios in Steamroller and what they actually end up being on the table. Like Recon. I don't know if any of the listeners would have played 40K like way back in the day, but Recon used to be a scenario in like 3rd edition 40K. And at that point, it was all about getting to like different areas of the table and really spreading out a lot. And I don't really see that kind of a vibe when I see like Recon and Warmachine, because it's still just circles and rectangles in the middle of the board.
Yeah, I was in the past, they actually had some more interesting ones where you could be taking over objectives and they'd be like shooting and you could move them and stuff like that. But they did away with all that right now. And I mean, it used to be a thing before where you'd have different shapes and sizes. And I think now that they've actually started selling a certain set, I don't think they're ever going to change that again.
Yeah, and honestly, I think there's a lot you can do with a certain set of tools as long as you're willing to kind of branch out. And I guess Warmachine is one of those really weird games where not only is there this notion of a scenario, but it's that you can win on. But as far as I know, it's one of the only games out there where if you can kill one model, the game is over.
Yeah, fair enough.
Kind of always has this extra little bit of something where any scenario you have to make has to be balanced off with the fact that, there's those assassination builds out there that are just going to reach out from 18 to 24 inches away and just murder your caster. So you kind of need to balance it out there. I guess the one thing that I've always kind of thought would be interesting is if some scenarios, and not all, and maybe not all tournaments, but like at some point people tried around with the idea of like maybe caster kill's not a win condition anymore, like an automatic one, but killing a caster gives you an inordinate number of scenario points, like 5 or something.
I mean, I could totally see. I mean, already they try and balance things so that some scenarios are set up to be more live and other ones aren't. So, and I think they used to maybe have that a little bit more where some scenarios didn't have kill box. So, I mean, your caster could be hiding in the very back, but now everything has kill box. So, do you think that could be a simple thing as that? Is this changing again so that half had kill box and half don't? Or do you think you'd actually change it to being like you say, where you don't win by assassination, you get X control points?
Yeah, I guess the tricky thing with Warmachine is that if you've been playing it for long enough time, you remember back in the days before Steamroller, where a lot of the times you would have, okay, I killed 90% of my opponent's army, but Vlad's just getting kited around, and then he's taking opportunities to kill everybody else. So as a concept, I like the idea of Killbox, where it's getting people towards the middle of the table where stuff is interesting. I guess the question really is at what level are we, or what does a live scenario really mean for us? Like, right now, as it stands, I believe it's got to be 5 points more than your opponent at the end of the turn.
Yeah, that's what it is right now, yeah.
Yeah, and which I think is pretty cool, but there's a few different game systems that approach it in different ways, right? So if caster kill was no longer an automatic game over, hypothetically, like let's say it was 5 victory points instead of an automatic win, then all of a sudden you could talk about things like, okay, let's have this be a game where you're playing to X number of turns. Mm-hmm. Because Warmachine is very different from a lot of other games where if you're playing Malifaux or Infinity or Blood Bowl or 40K or Age of Sigmar, tournaments will have some semblance of turn limit. Yeah. And Warmachine has that, but it's almost like they had to put it in there just for those outlying cases of like, you just can't go past 7 turns.
Now, something I want to also jump into before we get to too many fixes and stuff like that is we quickly touched on what were the negatives of what the scenario is right now, the package, but maybe also just the why and why we're here. So as far as I understand, we're in our case right now where things are very cut and paste, very simple, straightforward for 2 reasons. One, to keep things as symmetrical as possible to allow for competitive play, and 2, to be as similar as possible for new players to make it very simple, right? If every scenario was vastly different, it's harder for new players. So I guess my question, just going into that, is how valid even are those arguments?
I think they're actually pretty fair, right? Because you want a game to be accessible. You want a game, and if you want something that people can walk up to the table and have a rough idea as to what's going on, which is why, as a rule, I like the idea of standardized like kinds of things. Like if it's a circle, it's units. If it's a rectangle, it's beasts or warjacks or whatever. Mm-hmm. So that somebody they get it quite easily. I also like the idea of stuff being relatively clean for competitive play because you want it to be as fair as possible, right? Like ultimately, and we'll maybe get into this a little bit deeper, but if you want it to be fully balanced, we should be playing chess.
Yeah, right? And then one side goes first, right?
Yeah, like there's certain things around the idea of like the purely clean competitive scenario pack that is almost, in my mind, like a bit of an impossible goal in certain ways. It's just really thinking about what aspects are you willing to give up, or what's your focus going to be for those things to have it as close as what you want for your design space to be to make it work. And I think one of the things that Warmachine does pretty well is, they do promote playing in the middle of the board, right? Especially lately where they've really focused having more things centralized, which is really good. Again, making it accessible to newer players and making it as clean as possible for what they kind of have built for a long time. But I guess it really comes down to the idea that if you look at Steamroller now versus Steamroller probably up to about 8 years ago, it's really not that different. There's a couple little tweaks here and there, but it's more or less been the same style of scenarios for a very long time, whereas many other game systems have really evolved themselves during that time to where these used to be in my mind, some of the premier scenarios that you could run or ways to approach a game for a competitive play, but they're getting a little bit dated.
Yeah. Going into part of this a little bit deeper is, so one of the things we said there is that maybe they're very symmetrical to keep things competitive. What would you say are some good comparisons or some good examples, rather, of other games that have scenarios that are non-symmetrical and all different, and at the same time, it's also designed to be a very competitive and more so fair game, right? It's not one where I'm attacking the castle and the person in the castle is an 80% win of winning. It's something where it's non-symmetrical and each side is pretty even. Is there a really good game out there that is a good example of this?
So for a couple different reasons, I'm actually going to reference 40K on this one. First off, there's the ITC, which is basically the competitive governing body that is not directly affiliated with Games Workshop. Some of the people that are part of the ITC committee do playtesting and commentary at conventions for Games Workshop, but they're not inherently connected. And so the ITC, what they've done is they've broken down their missions into primary and secondary objectives. So the primary objectives, for the most part, are there's a certain number of objective markers on the table. Normally it's between 4 and 6, and you get a point every turn that you hold one. Mm-hmm. If in that game round you have more than your opponent, you score 2 points instead of just the 1. Then there's the other part of, did you kill an enemy unit? You get a point. Did your opponent kill an enemy unit? They get a point. Whoever killed more units in that whole game turn, they will, whoever gets more kills gets a point. And that's the primary. Then it goes on to the secondaries. And the secondaries are where it gets really interesting. The model they have right now is that the secondaries are broken down into 2 groups. One is like a killing secondary, and one is going to be more of like board control secondaries. So the killing ones are based around killing different kinds of units, either hordes or units of multi-wound models or vehicles or a mix of all of them, and you're going to pick one of those as what your target is. So it's kind of based on what you think your army can kill, but also what you're bringing, and you're choosing those secondaries as you start the game. The positioning ones are either like King of the Hill in the middle of the table, getting your enemy deployment zone, having models in all 4 corners of the table, that kind of stuff. And so you have to pick one of each, and then you get to pick a third one at random. Or not at random, at will, whatever you want. And those are going to be each worth 4 points per game total for each of them. So it'll be 12 points for secondaries and however many points for primaries, because I don't feel like doing math. But you could potentially be getting 4 off the primaries per turn.
So I guess maybe one of the more important questions right now then is there anything in Warmachine right now that would be stopping something like that from being almost directly used over here for a Warmachine scenario that wouldn't keep it fair? I mean, one of the things that comes straight to my mind is the idea of the 2 lists. So if you come into a game and know that one of the scenarios or one of the objective is, kill infantry, well, that's going to make me lean towards a list that has less infantry or, that type of a thing. Is there anything you can think of there that would not make it move over? And then the follow-up question being then, what could you change in Warmachine to make that transition more easy?
I guess one of the biggest things is that movement is so much more restricted in Warmachine. You don't have nearly as many vehicles that are moving as fast or as far. So the board maneuvering stuff can be a little bit trickier. Like in 40K, there's stuff that can be moving 20 plus inches a turn. And that's pretty common. Whereas that's super rare in Warmachine to see something remotely that fast.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's kind of the one thing. The other thing is that, and this might be a bit of a hot take, is the notion of 2 lists breaks the system entirely. Because a lot of these pick as you go based on your opponent. So you're thinking about your list when you're building it so that maybe you're wanting to think about, okay, I'm not going to max out giving up any of those killing secondaries based on what I have in my list. It was all built around the idea of it being one list. Whereas in Warmachine, where they came up with that 2 list idea to avoid the gotchas, right? So there wouldn't be those, I'm going to do a hard lean one way and hope my opponent doesn't bring stuff to deal with that. So they brought in the 2 lists so that people could have a way to kind of get around that.
Yeah, I was wondering about that because I mean, I feel the current scenarios are doing a very good job. Where, like we talked at the beginning, where a unit is the only one that can get circles, and a jack or a battle engine has to get a square, a rectangle. Because of that, that's forcing people to take much more balanced lists than they did before. And now that we're actually seeing that, I'm actually wondering if we could get away from doing two lists. And if we got away from doing two lists, then I think that a lot of things like we're saying with these other types of scenarios are a lot more plausible. And I mean, it'd be a lot easier to bring stuff to a tournament because they're only bringing one list. The only real issue then is the whole idea where, this caster counters this caster type thing. But even with that, I don't think that's as prevalent as it really people make it sound. But do you think that's really the big crux? Is that what we have to really challenge right now? I mean, one of the things that Hungerford said is maybe arcs won't be a thing, and it won't matter if you're in a front and a back arc, and that has people talking, but maybe we're not going deep enough, and we have to say, should we even have two lists?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know what the right answer is. I would suggest that why not try it, right? I think where we're at right now is that we've done everything the same way for so long that maybe we should just take a year and try a bunch of different stuff, right? Figure out what works best for certain kinds of tournaments, and me, I'm an advocate of different sizes of
Yep.
lists because your approach to the game changes at different sizes, which also means the approach to the scenario changes at different sizes. And do we try events where it's a one list event, and what does that look like? And we can sit here and speculate all we want, and any nerd with a microphone can do that as often as they want. But
we have them right now.
Exactly. But I think the measured response is really to figure out, like, okay, where can clearly not right now. But where can we try these things? How can we see how it goes? And I kind of got a feeling that maybe 6-8 months from now, everyone's going to be real hungry to be playing some games.
Yeah, for sure.
So maybe that's a time to just try something new. Get outside your comfort zone. See if it works, right? Because I remember back in the day having run events for, oh God, I don't even want to think about how many, it's getting closer to 20 years now, but for different game systems. But basically the idea was that the Games Workshop would always release, this is their core scenarios. And most of the events that were run would do like those core scenarios tweaked in a small way. Right? You remember that, right? Where it'd be like some little difference. So you'd have maybe this thing would be worth bonus points or that thing or whatever. And that way you would have a bit of variety. And I think just that curiosity of that exploration of trying different things is how we're going to find the best scenarios for the games that we play. And that goes all the way from maybe it's a subtle little change, like maybe we want to radically redesign, you can't have a subtle radical thing. So maybe it's a subtle thing like positioning of the existing stuff on the table. Maybe it's a radical thing like, do we go back to stuff like single lists with sideboards? Do we go back to things like having those options for some scenarios where reinforcements come in? Do we have these options that we used to do back in the day? Give them another whirl, change the context, flip things on its head, and just see how the game kind of shakes out. Because in terms of writing, I think the game is more balanced now than it has been for a while.
Yeah, I'd agree for sure.
Especially with the theme lists where, there's so many casters and models in the game right now. It's never going to be where if you take any model with any caster against any other model with any other caster, it's going to be even. It's not. There's just too many variables for that to be the case. But I am feeling now, like looking around at what people are playing, it's not like someone who plays Khador. These are my two casters I use, and I never look at the rest.
Yeah, fair enough.
And it's the exact same thing for their other buddy that plays Khador. There'll be one that's like, I'm more into Sorsha and her stuff, and someone else is like, I'm more into Vlad and his stuff, and then they have other complementary casters that go with them or whatever, right? So.
Mm-hmm. Another part I want to touch on too, just because we attacked the one side, but I want to go and discuss the other side too, is so we said one of the arguments is that you can't have it being non-symmetrical and being still competitive. We chatted a little bit about that. The other side was keeping it simple for new players. So can you think of a good example of other systems where scenarios are all over the place, and they have lots of different types, and yet it's very user-friendly and very easy to teach to new players?
Well, honestly, any scenario or any game that utilizes scenarios that use somewhat similar core mechanics. So, like Warmachine, I think is a great example because these kind of units hold those things, these kind of units hold those things. 40K, again, it still has objectives, and you hold an objective in the same way every time. And then if you are, let's say, using the Maelstrom cards, where you're randomly getting these are the things I need to do this turn, which is actually a lot of fun, and they've made it where you get to create that deck, so you have way more control over it. So instead of it being, here's your deck of 40 plus cards, you get to pick 18, and those are the ones you'll see over the course of the game. So it's actually made it really interesting. But it's all the same base mechanics. You're killing this thing, you're being in this place. And I think for me, if the stuff makes sense, right? Like if the way to win the game is something that someone watching a movie would have been like, that's a battle, that's what a battle looks like. And if the game is won by following those kind of steps, then it doesn't really matter exactly what the rules are that make that happen. It'll be easy to pick up for anybody.
So I think along with this, maybe another way to go with this is just the idea of attacker-defender scenarios. Because when it comes to trying to say, like, yes, I get this, those seem to be always the ones that hit it on the head, right? The ones where I'm trying to defend this bridge, I'm trying to defend this, and the other person's trying to attack and destroy it. Can you think of some great examples from other systems where they do it really well and ways that maybe that could be introduced to Warmachine?
Well, I guess the one game that I've been playing a lot lately that has the attacker-defender vibe is a game called Chain of Command. It's a World War II platoon-level game, which has very clear-cut scenarios. I don't know if it would dramatically carry over to Warmachine because it is more of a narrative game than it is a competitive game. But you've got very simple stuff of, like, here's the places that maybe you have your comms set up, and you've got a couple decoys, and your opponent has to try and take over the right one. And for them to win, they got to do that. For the defender to win, they just got to drive off the opponent. But again, a lot of it's played via narrative campaigns. So you're choosing, like, if you want to have stuff killed that game or save it for the next game, which doesn't really apply to Warmachine. Yeah, I don't know. It's really tricky to think about those kind of mechanics that are that different, you know?
Because even something like I was wondering, like, let's say, for example, in this one scenario, one side on their side of the board, they're going to be having 4 objectives or maybe 3 objectives and a flag, or who knows what that is. And then basically over those 7 turns, the defender has to defend them and the attacker has to destroy those 3 objectives, score the flag, whatever it is. Could something like that be built in Warmachine where it's actually fair? Where, tested over 100 times, it's roughly a 50-50 win for the 2 sides.
I don't know, because those kind of scenarios are inherently asymmetrical, and they should be because it makes them interesting. I think ultimately the scenarios that make the most sense for competitive play are the ones where it's like both armies are arriving at a central something at the same time.
Yep.
So that way they're roughly on equal footing. But then, you have the conversation of, I remember back in 8th edition fantasy, you had the Watchtower.
Yeah.
Right? Which, whatever your feeling of that scenario was, it was really straightforward. There's a Watchtower in the middle, and you want to go get it.
Yeah, straightforward and very different.
Right? Like, that's what you want, that's what you're going to get. And that's why, and I kind of touched on it before, but the idea of that if we create a little bit more of a narrative along with what the scenarios are, even if it's a couple sentences, and then you recommend certain kinds of terrain in certain places for them, which honestly is one way to start balancing the games, if you know roughly what the scenario or the terrain should look like. And 2, it gives it a little bit more character. Like, all right, so in the middle of this zone, if you're holding it, there is X. Whether or not it does anything in the game, that's left up to whoever's running the event and if they want to make it janky or not. But it's important because of this. And if you can tell people why the stuff they're trying to do is important with some kind of a narrative, it's going to make that much more sense automatically to a green player, as opposed to, us trying to have that, okay, so why was it that these ones are only for units and those ones are only for warjacks, right? Whereas if it's like, okay, this one's a building, only units can get in that building, warjacks are too big.
Yeah.
This is where units go. Oh, this one over here is like no man's land for units. They'd get murdered. This is where warjacks have to go, right? Or something with heavy lifting or cargo or whatever.
Yeah, something else like that.
Yeah, and so the core mechanics don't have to change, but just how you're thinking about them. Mm-hmm. And if people are thinking about them and talking about them and, constructing tables, whether or not they're 2D or 3D or whatever, not the point, that are kind of geared around supporting that narrative, which you can do in a fairly fair way, then you're going to have scenarios that are going to feel more interesting, that are going to be more exciting. They're going to have that little bit more narrative piece automatically thrown in, which the competitive players can continue to ignore if they want to,
yep.
or which is fine. And then the ones that are maybe wanting a little bit more of that cinematic narrative just automatically get, even though the game isn't really that different.
So I guess maybe going with that idea, is Privateer Press maybe already doing this? Because, with the Oblivion campaign, they have different scenarios and cards that you can earn and can be used in other ones. Is that maybe what Privateer Press is already doing, where if you want these different types of scenarios, here are these campaigns that come out every few years, and for everyone else, you have your typical Steamroller. Is that maybe already in place?
Honestly, kind of. At least it's moving towards that. I guess the trick with Privateer Press is until they do something a second time, there's no guarantee it's going to be what they're doing moving forward.
Yeah, fair enough.
Because there's been a lot of times where it's like, this is what we're doing now, and then they do it once and then completely 180.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's interesting. I think finding the times to have those more narrative campaigns are a lot of fun. But even just how you think about, talk about, and approach the scenarios can make the difference. Not to sound like too much of a broken record, but I actually found, for me personally, it made a lot more joy for me playing games at Warmachine when I just did those little tweaks of what terrain was where relative to what kind of zones, so that it felt cooler and it felt more narrative and it felt more interesting. So that helps you break up from the monotony of an otherwise very simple mechanic. So when you think about a game like Malifaux, almost everything's based around the idea of dropping different markers. And it's one action to drop a marker. And so no matter what you're doing, dropping a marker is the exact same mechanic. It doesn't matter. But those markers can interact with other models in different ways, or the narrative around what they're there for and what they mean changes, which makes it feel very different.
Yeah. I remember playing with somebody that just came over from Flames of War, and what happened in that game is we started doing the terrain, and they started setting up, we're like, okay, we're going to have this road here, and there's going to be houses on either side, and I asked the question, like, okay, well, what does the road do? Does it speed up your units, only speed up the jacks? I was like, well, no, it's just the road. And it's just kind of like that real difference where, I was more used to that, okay, this is how much terrain you have, this much for every quadrant, this does that, and really coming from that Flames of War mindset where, well, no, we're fighting in this town, so it has to look like a town. And then, that has nothing to do with the scenario, but all of a sudden, once you had something like that, like this actually looked like a town, made it a lot more easier to think that, okay, and then this place that you're trying to take could be something, as opposed to just random circle that's in this random, assortment of terrain being thrown down. So I think that's what you're saying, right?
Absolutely. And for me, that's kind of on I think our bare minimum of trying to find a way to rejuvenate the scenarios. Because at that point, we're not really doing much of a major change. We're changing the narrative a little bit. But then we can talk about those other things, like we're saying, of maybe we want to go to one list instead of two, now that the things are getting a little bit more balanced. And believe it or not, we are seeing comp in Warmachine now. Because unless you're building something comped around a theme list, you're not. When's the last time you saw a non-theme list at a tournament?
A serious one? Never. You always have that person that's new to the game or something like that. So like, oh, this is what
Correct.
I brought. I didn't do it a theme. But yeah, anyone that's been playing for a while, always in a theme.
Yeah, so we've kind of almost, as much as we don't want to maybe admit it, Warmachine is kind of comped again.
Well, one of the things that's also kind of funny with this whole 2 list, 1 list thing is that, of course, they have the version where you can be having 3 lists. And so you would think that, like, okay, if it was really important to be competitive, to be having all your bases covered, everyone would be on board with wanting to do 3 lists. but in my experience, almost nobody wants to do 3 lists, partly because they don't want to have that big of a movement tray, but also they just found that they never used that 3rd list, that everything was already covered. And then honestly, when you look at people's score sheets, they usually run the 1 list anyway. But another topic I want to see what you thought of is just the idea of attrition sometimes making scenarios useless. Now, this really comes back from when I used to play 40K, and that was a long time ago, so things could have changed. But it seemed like a lot of times back then, it'd be, you have to do X. Okay, whatever it is, I'm just going to worry and really focus on attrition. And then when my opponent is dead, I'll do whatever the thing is. Oh, I have to go to this building. Oh, I have to go off this board edge. Sure, I'll just wipe out my opponent and then do that in the late game. Is that still an issue over there? Or how would you really address something like that?
That's a tricky one in a lot of ways, because it's so hard to define exactly what attrition really is. Like, is it? But I guess when it comes to a game like 40K, right, it still is it's something it always fights with, right? Because it is the I go, you go with huge ranges and lots of guns. There still are some of the issues around, getting that first turn. But I'm finding that it is adapting a little bit more because of how some of the terrain rules are, because of how some of the lists are kind of constructed. People are really trying to make their lists where going second is the optimal choice. Just so that way they know they're always going to be in the optimal situation if they can.
Yeah.
They can put themselves in a situation to do well. And so the players that are consistently winning more of their games are the ones that are putting themselves in that mindset. When it comes to Warmachine, man, it's such a tricky game with attrition, because you can have turns where like a single model could take out like 20 dudes with the right combination of rules and dice. You could have games where that one model does nothing. Yeah, I don't know. It's really tricky. I think one of the bigger issues right now, when it comes to attrition making scenarios invalidated, is that even though only certain units can claim particular things, any unit can contest them.
Yeah, that's really important.
Right. And so if we were in a situation where certain things could claim and only those things could contest, with maybe a few exceptions, right? But not unilaterally everything can contest all the time, then maybe that changes how you're constructing your lists, changes how you're positioning your units, because having just like a colossal towing 2 zones no longer inherently means that those 2 zones are shut down.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that was my idea, and I don't know what you think about that, is just the idea where if you don't want people just to focus on attrition, ignoring the scenario, and then just capturing the points in the end, make it so that those points are worth more in the early game and then decreasing worth as time goes on. So, I mean, almost right there, it's already forcing you again to get in there and do it, and actually what the Steamroller wants you to do, right? Not stay back and hide, go in and actually get in these zones, or else you'll lose on scenario. But more importantly, you have to get in there early because they're worth more early. Do you think something like that might work in Warmachine?
Maybe. The trick with Warmachine always is how disparate the speeds are for various factions. So as someone that plays mercs exclusively, really, I think of how my dwarves will play differently from my pirates, will play differently from my cephalics, right? And how if I was looking at scoring points early was how to win games, I don't think the dwarves would see the table.
Yeah, it's all Shay all day.
And honestly, Siphon can do some real bullshit with that. So,
yeah,
it's
really tough trying to apply it to the Warmachine rule set.
Yeah, it's because there's so much variety, right? It is probably the biggest game that I know of in terms of options, right? Because since the game came out, very rarely have they redone a unit. It's always been adding new ones and adding new ones. Whereas with Games Workshop, they did the notion of, okay, when we do a new cycle, we're going to update the old units and the old models and give them slightly new rules. Whereas with Warmachine, there's 2 different units of long gunners. Why?
Reasons?
Right? I'm sure there's reasons. But they almost kind of painted themselves into a little bit of a hole where there's so many choices. Like so many choices in that game. That
Yeah, and Hungerford's already said that it has to come to a point where there'll be a limited type format. I mean, they're doing it for basically champions now, but I mean, looking down the line, it'll just have to be part of the game at some point if they don't change something.
Yeah, and honestly, I think RideQuest and the impact of RideQuest on Warmachine is maybe one of the best things they could have done, where they can support the game by making another game and just trickle in solos and warcasters, like slowly, that work for a couple factions. Or if you're mercs, you just have way too many new options. But, that's
I have so
whatever.
many new solos that's sitting on my shelf now. I might never use them, but they look cool, so I wanted to buy them.
Yeah, and I play RideQuest because it's a great game. So I've got a lot of them painted. At one point, I want to just bring a nothing but RideQuest model and then a battle group list, because that'll just be funny. I don't think it'll be good, but it'll be funny.
That's the main thing.
Yeah.
One of the things, just bringing back to this scenario thing that I was hoping to get for you, just as we're getting to the end here, is looking out at all the other games that you've played. What are some of the most unique scenario things you've seen out there, or maybe overall that it's not the best scenario type set to use, but this one idea that came from there is just so good, so interesting that maybe that little part, that idea could come over. Do you have any examples like that from other games?
Yeah, so the game was garbage, but it had one of the coolest rules I've ever dropped Fleet Commander, the spaceship battle game.
Okay.
And what they did is you broke your fleet into battle groups, and each battle group would have basically like a battle rating depending on how much was in it. So if you had more big ships in it, it would have a higher number. And if you had maybe just more like smaller scout ships in it, it would have a lower number. And it could be anything in between, because it could be any combination. You had to have a certain number of battle groups depending on the size of the game. And each battle group was placed on a card. And you would, at the start of your turn, set up your deck of cards, which deck is maybe a bit of an exaggeration because it'd be like 4 or 5, in the order that you want to activate your battle groups that turn. And so at the start of the turn, both players flip their card over, and whoever's number was lower would get to activate their battle group first. And you would continue to do this, alternating activating. So if you activated, once we both activate the battle group, we flip again. Whoever's number is lower, that battle group gets to activate first. So
Gotcha.
It kind of rewarded you for being thoughtful of how you were constructing the portions of your army that would activate at different times, because just having your biggest, baddest stuff always going first wasn't always the best idea.
Because then you're sitting around for a few rotations till it comes back.
Well, you still get to go second in that turn, but maybe someone's a bunch of Corvettes that are really good at doing something to a piece that you want to not die, and they can just muck it up because they're going faster and getting in there. So you had to really think about how you're constructing it. That being said, I have no idea how the hell you make that work with Warmachine, but it was a really cool mechanic. It was a lot of fun.
And I mean, we don't have to have all the solutions here, but I mean, if we bring up these ideas that, hey, from this game that maybe almost nobody played, but man, this idea was awesome, the smarter people out there can always figure a way to make this work.
Yeah. Another one that I really enjoy is from Chain of Command, where you're playing on a larger table. It's like a 6x4, even for a platoon-sized game. So it's anywhere between 30 and 50 models. And the way it works is before you deploy any models, you have what's called patrol phase. And that's where you're moving patrol markers around, and you alternate activations, moving them. And they'll be, depending on the scenario, they'll start in different, and you'll have anywhere between 3 and 4. And you move them, and they have to stay within 12 inches of another one. And they can't move more than 12 inches at a time. Once they are within 12 inches of an opponent's one, they're both locked and they can't be moved anymore. And you keep moving them around until one player has all of theirs locked in place. And then you use those patrol markers to determine where your units are going to be coming from. So that you're getting this quick little maneuvering phase before the game starts to set up, okay, where on the battlefield is important to me? And then you kind of figure that out. And then based on where those markers are, you then figure out where your jump-off points are, where your troops are actually coming in from.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah.
So that's another cool mechanic. I really like it because it's like a mini game at the start of the game where you're able to do a lot of maneuvering and shuffling without having to move models around. Like a lot of Napoleonics, you're spending the first couple hours just maneuvering stuff into place.
How about anything else that's for like quirky, just scenario stuff, though? I mean, there's lots of interesting gameplay things. What about just like weird scenario stuff out there that works really well? I know before you talked a lot about the ones in Malifaux. Is there anything else like that?
Honestly, the one quirky thing right now I'm loving is for 40K, like I was talking about, where you're constructing your objective deck and you can change it at the start of every game. So, like, one of the things would be kill an enemy psyker. If you're playing against a list that doesn't have any psychers, take the card out, put something else in. So you're kind of constructing the objectives for your army ahead of time, but you don't know exactly when they're going to come up. And so it's one of those, it's very dynamic. It changes every time. You know what your army's strengths are, so you take more objectives based around those strengths. You can maybe pick one or two based around your opponent's weaknesses, and you can make for a really exciting game. A really cute mechanic they have with it is that for most now, you have a hand of 5, which you'll draw back up to 5 at the start of every turn, and you'll place 3 on the table, 2 face up, 1 face down.
Yep.
And you can if you accomplish those at the end of the turn, you score the points. If not, you can also discard them, put new ones out next turn, keep one of them out if you know you're going to score it the turn after, and go from there. And I found that style actually, even though it feels like there's a decent amount of randomness, if you're mindful of how you construct your deck, you can actually have a very fair game in what seems like a very random scenario.
So maybe like to try and apply to something in Warmachine, then that'd be something where you'd have a deck where it'd be saying things like flag, objective, circle, rectangle, and then at the start of the game you'd be drawing a couple of cards and seeing what you'd be able to set up on your side of the board. I mean, of course, hopefully we could get things that are a little bit more interesting, but to how it is right now, is that kind of basically what it is?
Well, I think the closer analog would be like, okay, some of them would be based around killing an infantry unit or warjack or a solo, and then some of them would be based around holding a zone, either the circle or the rectangle or a flag, or destroying an objective or something like that. And so you would know, like, if your army was better at going after flags or holding zones or killing units and having a mix of the two and how you would do that. And that would honestly probably port fairly well, but it would only port if it was a one list format.
Yeah. Because otherwise, you'd be like, oh, unless again, maybe you picked your army before you drew your cards, so you didn't know, like, okay, this is my infantry one. I'll have to take my infantry list. But
yeah, and it just, even if you had the option of, okay, so you do your list check-in, you figure that out, then you pick your decks. That's just probably more time than necessary going into the game.
I'm just, again, I think it's a win-win where we could take one list and then it'll be better for a scenario. And then again, I have to bring less things to a tournament. So,
and also, if we want to talk about the benefit of making, one of the biggest problems for Warmachine has always been, not always, but in the last 10 years, has been this idea of, oh no, you don't just buy one army, you got to buy 2.
Oh, okay, yeah. Just
right?
because
I've
like the
heard that.
crossover faction stuff?
No, just because you have to have 2 lists.
Oh, okay, yeah, I got you.
Right? Like, so someone that's really into this one army, this one caster, and they're like, this is my boy, this is who I want, this is what I want to do. And then they're like, oh, also, if you want to be competitive, here's the other list you also have to bring. Yeah. I've often heard that as a problem. Malifaux had the same problem because you could pick any master at the start of the game and then build your list around that. So you realistically, it's not just a $50 box to start, it's 3 $50 boxes and like $100 worth of other models.
Yeah, surprise.
Yeah, joke's on you. You can play with one, but you need way more.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely last hot take. Biggest thing that Warmachine has for scenario that a lot of other games don't is we don't have a graduated win. So in Warmachine, you win or you lose, whereas in other games, there's major, minor wins, stuff like that allows you to have scenarios where, like, this is a minor part, this is a major part, and really lets you kind of differentiate those things, whereas Warmachine is just yes, no, did you win or not? Is that a problem in Warmachine, and does that need to change?
I think the answer, you're going to not like this, is sometimes and maybe.
You politician, you.
Well, it's not even that. It's just the guy that gets bored easily because I play so many different games that I've got a short attention span, obviously. So, like I said, I've really want to see an event where caster kill is not a win scenario. First off, because it would dramatically change how you play the game. And second off, all of a sudden, all those rules about inert warjacks and wild beasts and all those things would actually come into play. Because there's like a whole page in the rulebook that never matters.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever seen a wild beast ever.
Right? Because it never comes up. And then having those lesser and having those jack marshals and those other pieces that have for taking stuff over, all of a sudden those would become useful for those rules again, which are pointed into them. And honestly, a lot of the jack marshals are the ones you don't see as often. Or if you do, they're because they have good other rules and not for the jack marshalling stuff. But yeah, I think the only problem is anytime you make a statement across the board of there's a hot take, it needs to be better. It's great for the people having that conversation or the ones that have that value opinion. But I know there's some people who take a lot of joy from figuring out the best way to do an assassination in Warmachine. And because it's the only game that really has that, if you just flat out took that out of the game entirely, I think a lot of people would not be happy with that. Like, I don't think Paul would win ever again.
Well, I think another thing to keep in mind, too, is that it even if it wasn't a win condition, it basically still is. Like let's go back to Warhammer Fantasy, where it was not a win condition to kill my Orc and Goblin general, but if you did, you basically won the game. And it'd be the same thing with Warmachine, right? If all your jacks go inert, if all your beasts go wild, and you no longer have your biggest piece, it's really a win condition, to be fair.
Yeah. And I think that I would be most curious to see, somewhere between 3 and 5 points automatically for the scenario for killing a caster, and then maybe have it be like a 5-round cap, and whoever gets the most points at the end wins, right? I would be curious to see how that played out.
More jank to be had, more fun to be had once we finally get out of this pandemic.
Right, just any chance to try playing more games in a different... Now, the only problem is whether or not Hungerford's going to think about doing core fundamental changes like mono listing and no more caster kill. Like, those are pretty big changes to Steamroller.
Yeah. Well, luckily we got CID, so you never know what happens. But we got to cut it off here. So, Tom, I want to thank you again. I think you really brought that expertise from all these other games. Maybe last thing just to do here, just to kind of shout out the stuff that you do and where they can find your work.
Yeah, so we've been on a bit of a hiatus for a little while, especially with the Rona. But Hobby Night in Canada is our podcast, Facebook page, Instagram account. You can check out various hobby projects there. You can message us if you have any questions for hobby stuff, for any questions that haven't been answered already on the podcast, or anything else like that you might have. We're more than happy to help share expertise. We're just people that love the hobby and love playing games, and too much to focus on any one game, unfortunately for my wallet, but it's depressing. But no, and so we do that. Normally, when things are normal, we do a podcast every 2 weeks, but obviously things are abnormal, and we might have to figure out how to change with the times, I guess. But yeah, so that's basically where you can find me and what I do. And
awesome. Well, again, thanks again for taking the time to coming on here and having this chat about Scenario. And everyone at home, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you later. Bye.
Thanks for having me, man.